My name is Giovanna Gassage, if you don't already know me. I'm the chief librarian, and I am so thrilled to have our authors with us today, Sacha, Luis, and Chris, who've joined us to share on their book, Carceral Communities in Latin America. I would like to give them a formal introduction, so you'll hear a little bit about who they are. So, Sacha Darke is reader in criminology at the University of Westminster and course leader of the MA Criminology. He is visiting lecturer in law at the University of Sao Paulo, an affiliate of King's Brazil Institute, King's College London. He was the Leverhulme Trust Research Fellow from 2020 to 2022. His research and teaching interests include global criminology, Latin American prisons, prison higher education, and the internationalization of convict criminology. He is currently researching community prisons in Brazil. He convenes convict criminology programs at 4 prisons that involve collaborative research and learning between students inside and outside prison. He is also, in addition to the author of the book we'll be discussing today, the author of Conviviality and Survival, co-producing Brazilian Prison Order. We also have with us today Dr. Luis Duno Gottberg, who is a professor at Rice University in Houston, Texas. He has taught at the University of Simón Bolívar in Caracas, Florida Atlantic University. He specializes in 19th, 20th, and 21st century Latin American and Caribbean culture with an emphasis on race and ethnicity, politics and violence, and visual culture. He is the author of La Humanidad como Mercancía, La Esclavitud Moderna en América, and Solventar las diferencias, la ideológica del mestizaje en Cuba. He is one of the co-editors of the book we're discussing today, and has also written several other works related to both Latin America and also a lot on film. He's also a film scholar, so I find that incredibly interesting. At the moment, he is currently engaged in 2 projects: Gazing at Disasters, on the photographic representation of natural catastrophic events in the Americas and the Caribbean, and with Andres Antayano, Penal Carnivalesque, a project derived from the book we're discussing today. And lastly, we have Christopher Garces, who is an urban political anthropologist and interdisciplinary scholar with field specialization in Andean Latin America. Almost all his ethnographic work explores interconnections between state politics and Catholic activism in Ecuador. However, this abiding interest in politico-theological struggles has led him to research and publish on diverse political processes and ethical problems across the Andes, Western Europe, and the United States. So thank you all so much for joining us. I will hand the floor over to, I guess we'll start with Sacha.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. So fantastic. So yeah, first of all, we'd like to thank Giovanna and the UNOV Library for inviting us to speak about our book, Carceral Communities in Latin American Prisons today. 3 of the 4 editors of the volume were able to be here today. And we published a book in 2021, and it was republished in Portuguese in 2022, just a few months ago now. So Carceral Communities is the fruit of a rich tradition in Latin American prison ethnographies that has emerged in the 21st century, much of which not previously available to an English-speaking audience. Our project can be traced back to the 2015 annual conference of the Latin American Study Association held in Puerto Rico, where some of us met for the first time, and where we also made contact with other academics and PhD students doing extraordinary research on matters of everyday prison governance, survival, and community, as well as links between prisons and their local areas. So Chris and I went on in 2017 to publish a special edition, Informal Dynamics of Survival. I'll just go back, that's the first picture we have there, special edition of the Prison Service Journal. And this included a mixture of academic papers and first-hand accounts by former prisoners and current prison officers, and covered 7 South American and 2 Central American countries. It concluded with a paper co-authored by James Cavallaro, then president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. But by the time that journal edition was published, we had joined Louise and Andres and Tejano to make plans to publish this larger volume that includes a breadth of original papers on an even wider scale range of countries, and which focuses more specifically on ethnographic research. So it is with great pleasure that we introduce our book project to an international audience for the first time today. And I'll hand over to Chris to summarize the introductory chapter. Then Louise and I, or first I, will briefly introduce our own individual chapters, and Louise will summarize the conclusion, which he wrote with Andres. So we'll try to speak for no more than 25 minutes in order to leave plenty of time for questions. Thank you very much. So I'll hand over to Chris Garces now.
Wonderful. Can everyone hear me? Yes, great. Thanks, Sacha, and to Giovanna for that this lovely invitation. Sacha demonstrated the genealogy of how these networks of scholars came together to form carceral communities in Latin America. A book by Paul Grave. We owe a debt of gratitude to Paul Grave for their willingness to publish a 420-page volume. Not something that we often see in the cost-cutting academy of today. I personally would like to thank the 2 universities I've worked at under this period of research and writing. First Cornell University and now Universidad San Francisco de Quito. They've been instrumental in the intellectual freedom to undertake serious, timely research into a problem that affects most globalized countries, but as we hope to demonstrate, Latin America with particular acuity. One of the key issues that brought most of these authors together over a decade ago, in some cases quite longer, is the continued existence of illicit traffic and in Latin American prisons, and the peculiar circumstance of inmate self-governance, of inmates themselves governing plenty more aspects of prison life than one would see in the globalized North. A problem that arises from lack of prison subsidization and understaffing, and a problem for criminology to pursue. But scholars from all sorts of disciplines and backgrounds have entered into the prisons of Latin America, and not all of them have been criminologists. This volume brought together a full slate of academics, say from anthropology, sociology, policy studies, geography, film studies, the list goes on. Most of whom, however, shared ethnography in common, a long-term first-person or team interdisciplinary research on a community and the problems that beset it. Right. Our theorization of the prison as a community and the need to study like dynamics in that community from an ethical standpoint looks at the way in which all this traffic in goods and bodies and illicit materials uh, is mediated and remediated through different kinds of violence that are difficult to track unless you take the different constituents of community into account. What do we mean when we talk about community? Well, we're talking about the bonds of extra and intramural relationships that make the prison a kind of living institution with a pulse and an identity, often fractured these days. So the ethics of community both mediate and remediate the constitution of the prison in today's world, right? If there's a claim that allows us to articulate our prison research with researchers of other institutions and social or cultural political processes outside the prison, it's that the abandon of youth today cuts in two directions, right? Youth in Latin America, particularly the urban working class poor, are, yes, indeed discarded from pastoral institutions and often hunted. Youth also have a certain cultural license, often that they arrogate to themselves and between each other to act with a certain kind of wanton violence, right? So carceral community is a term we've coined to think more deeply about the intramural as well as extramural violence implicit within prison systems today, particularly those that swell in size. And if there is a key claim we make, it's that gang and cartel politics, maps onto and makes use of these captive populations, of these carceral communities, more than vice versa, right? More than vice versa. And this is a hard-won insight. Right. So in the remainder of my presentation, I'm just going to read some brief excerpts from the chapter I co-authored with Sacha Darke, and kick the conversation back to you, Luis. Through years of collaborative research with people who inhabit prison facilities, ethnographers understand intuitively that carceral communities quite often exist to defy the names bestowed on them by non-incarcerated prison specialists. In contrast to economic gain theories, abstract archetypal systems, and cognitive behaviorist understandings of prisoners' motives, activist and self-reflexive ethnographic models help to comprehend prison dynamics, system-wide problems, and unintentional harms of living in cages from the perspective of prisoners themselves. Ethnographic research today may have its empirical strengths and limitations and tendencies to explore the dark sides of contemporary life, but long-term, first-person, theoretically informed fieldwork carried out on the insides as well as outsides of prison facilities brings forward unusual insights into what goes without saying across the grotesque task of storing away human beings in states of punitive custody. The prison ethnographer's mode of bearing secondary witness to a problematic ethics of captivity, we submit, offers untold humanizing perspectives onto the formation of communities largely invisible or misrecognized by the state in its unstinting obsessions with policing sovereign violence and control. It's to the study of this most curious blind spot in research on prison worlds that volume contributors from a variety of different disciplinary backgrounds direct their ethnographic fieldwork, policy insights, and personal concerns. In this endeavor, we therefore put forward our theory of carceral community and demonstrate how reflexive ethnographic field work allows for extraordinary depth of inquiry into these infra-political formations. The most influential Latin American research on carcerality to date has focused on neoliberal and post-neoliberal state policing and regime changes between them, either in one direction or another. The prison has indeed quietly shifted its role in state-organized society from being institutions of social rehabilitation to an interiorized dumping grounds for the mass warehousing or internment of criminal subjects, or the illogical neoliberal endpoint of an increasingly militarized penalization of poverty. I'm referring to key early works by Birkbeck and Lecointe here. Building on these foundational frameworks, our volume is among the first collective works to systematically, comparatively explore the multiple ways in which disavowed non-state kernels of community building potential develop behind the edifice of prison walls, allowing for illicit circulation of all kinds and in between penal institutions themselves. If there are historical and intellectual precedents to viewing carceral community as such, they would include Durkheimian sociology and its successive interdisciplinary interlocutors. In this trajectory of sociological thought, different forms of organic solidarity and the maintenance of conscience collective always require a material, performative manifestation of community as a proxy for localized international relations, subtly requiring the exercise of soft power, ritual, and liaisonship or kinship of various kinds, as well as hard power, taboo, expulsion, or abandonment in any active community building process. Carceral communities, as our ethnographers demonstrate, form out of the state's aggregation of individuals who find themselves already socially abandoned by the state. But such subjects become carceral communities through performed everyday projects that reframe the mythic reattributions of prisoners from dehumanized to humanized subjects. The specter of the state's mythic foundational violence shadows these prisoners in their acts and programs of self-recovery. As the volume contributors make clear, carceral communities indicate a strange kind of relation to the imposition of civil death by sovereign state order, for it is rather precisely the fact that carceral communities can also exercise countervailing myth-making power and influence. And just think about the way in which the public media imaginary is haunted right now by the specter of prison violence. It is precisely the fact that carceral communities can also exercise countervailing myth-making power and influence, both within the complex and as evidenced by prison ethnography, ethnographic field work undertaken in the last 20 years, projecting their interest far beyond the space of the prison itself, that makes them so indispensable to ordinary prison governance, and so frightening a public specter when unaligned with prison administrations, or pitched in conflict with one another. Unlike the figure for whom political speech cannot issue forth, the influential member of a carceral community plainly exhibits speech always capable, in potentia at least, of challenging, upturning, or partly refashioning carceral order. This is the last bit of my intro. Symptomatically, the so-called gang leader, typically being held in a super maximum security cell, is detained under conditions of radical isolation precisely because a single word from him, a mere gesture, can set in motion a chain of events that undermines prison security and penal state control as such. True, Latin American gang leaders may wield extortive or deadly violence, They are often quickly relegated to the most dehumanizing forms of isolation, custody, and at the mere hint of being involved in violence on the blocks or outside the prison itself. Prison scholarship as a whole is categorically riven by the penal state's inherent vulnerability or custodial handling at loggerheads with prison gangs in the face of such episodes. But to clarify once more, prison ethnographers categorically do not seek to adumbrate or in any event defend the exercise of gang or prisoner violence wherever it arises, nor does ethnographic research engage in the whitewashing of gang violence, turning it into something it is not when documenting the active humanizing role of carceral communities and their disavowal by the state. Rather, and this is most important to us, we propose to all prison scholarship and international schools of criminology that we should also consider the ethical matter of carceral communities humanizing affordances, or simply declare as a matter of fact something which already exists, and move forward from this basic understanding. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to introduce my chapter briefly, and then I'll hand over to Louise. So okay, so yeah, so my sole authored chapter, self-governing prison communities, focuses on the importance of carceral communities to everyday prison order and everyday survival in Brazil. So it's a shorter version of the introductory chapter to a monograph that I originally published in 2018, Conviviality and Survival, as Giovanna introduced at the beginning. I have researched Brazilian prisons for the past 15 years. Most of the prisons I've researched or visited held men, including 3 that I focus on in this chapter. So first, the infamous Carandiru prison in São Paulo, scene of one of Latin America's greatest prison tragedies, when in 1992, 300 shock troops, many armed with machine guns, entered cell block 9 in response to a dispute among rival groups of inmates, and in 30 minutes killed or mortally injured at least 111. I visited Carandiru in 2005 after it had been deactivated. The second prison I focus on in this chapter, I'll call it a prison, is a police station in Rio de Janeiro that at the time held 500 men. I completed my first ethnographic study there in 2010. And the third prison I focus on this chapter is a voluntary sector administered APAC prison, where I stayed as a guest for 3 weeks to complete my second ethnographic study in 2012. So the chapter introduces 7 key features of the Brazilian prison system, all of which are also features of prison systems across the Latin American region, as Chris Garces and I originally outlined in our introduction to informal dynamics of survival and expanded on in the introduction to carceral communities. So these key features can be briefly outlined as follows. So firstly, mass incarceration. Brazil's prison population has risen a remarkable 1,000% since the country's return to democracy in 1985, far in excess of any rise in violent crime. Secondly, inhumane conditions. Today, many of its prisons hold 1 inmate per square meter of cell space, for example. Thirdly, staff shortage. Even at full capacity, full staff capacity, many Brazilian prisons today operate with up to 200 prisoners per guard on duty in the cell block. conviviality. At the same time, however, the average Brazilian prison is not as disorderly or its staff-inmate relations so conflictual as our established northern theories on prison life might predict. Co-governance. In Brazil, prison managers formally recruit trustee prisoners and informally leave inmate hierarchies to manage even the simplest of daily routines, like sleeping, distributing food, locking and unlocking cells. Prison officers rarely have to enter the cell block corridors except for occasional blitzes to check for contraband and tunnels for escape. More controversially, prison managers also rely on inmate hierarchies to maintain discipline and resolve disputes that arise among prisoners. Inmate leaders run their cell blocks through overseeing what are often described as rules of procedure. And these rules provide for mutual aid as well as mutual protection among carceral communities, typically described by Brazilian prisoners as colectivos, collectives. So such inmate participation in everyday prison governance is grounded in reciprocal staff-inmate relations of trust, support, and dialogue. And while fragile and varied, inmate participation helps maintain relatively positive institutional environments that keep most prisons in better order and enable most prisoners to better survive. Gangs. Moreover, these traditions of conviviality and co-produced order have strengthened rather than weakened with the rise of so-called criminal factions in the post-dictatorial period. Finally, since 2020, I have switched attention to exploring Brazil's tradition of inmate governance in the country's voluntary sector or part voluntary sector administered community prisons, including the EPAC system. In these reintegration or resocialization centres, as they are officially known, inmates are formally recruited to oversee disciplinary and security norms and regulations through the medium of officially constituted inmate councils. So as the chapter progresses, I introduce these key features of Brazilian prisons with detailed reflections of two incidences of prison disorder, one major at Carandiru, the other mundane at the EPAC prison, and an account of my first visit to the police station in Rio de Janeiro. Today, I only have time to cover one of these reflections, the first one briefly. So the incident I focus on in the chapter occurred a few years before the 1992 police massacre, when the head inmate in cell block 9 failed to stop drug dealers from approaching other prisoners' families on visiting days to ask them to pay their loved ones' debts. A few days later, he also failed to stop prison staff being assaulted while held captive during a rebellion. These were both considered serious breaches of not only inmate but staff inmate codes at the prison. In response, the head of security allowed a rival prisoner to form a new leadership in the cell block. The 200 inmates that made up the previous cell block hierarchy were removed to other parts of the prison. So to conclude my brief introduction to this chapter today, what struck me about this major breakdown of order in the pre-criminal faction era was the ease by which order was subsequently negotiated and restored by the prison administration. Breakdowns in co-governance arrangements do not always end so peacefully. The police massacre a few days later is just one example of many prison atrocities that have occurred in modern times across the Latin American region. Ironically, in the state of São Paulo, it was the rise of the first command of the capital in the wake of the Carangido massacre that unified prisoners and put an end to the cycles of exploitation and violence that preceded it. Today, São Paulo's prisoners and prison staffs speak in terms of the state's prisons being pacified and the state's prisons being a safer place to live or work. I'll just add here that, of course, we're not talking about ideals, but we're talking about the realities of a prison system that has been effectively abandoned by the state to the few people who work there and the many people who are imprisoned there. Thank you. I'll just stop sharing my screen. Second, and I'll pass over now to Louise. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen while.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Giovanna, for the invitation, and thank you to everybody who's present to listen to our work. It's good to see you, Sacha and Chris. I like to preface by saying that I'm not a criminologist. My background is in cultural studies, though I've been doing interdisciplinary work combining the fields of visual culture, literary studies, critical theory, and ethnography. I will talk today briefly about the chapter I contribute to the book and a little bit about the conclusion. The chapter that I contribute to the book came about on the occasion of me being invited to teach in a prison in Venezuela. The name of the prison doesn't appear in the chapter. I changed it. But at that moment, in that prison, the group of prisoners were trying to do a film, motus proprio. They wanted to do a film to kind of describe their life in prison. But then we learned that the other purpose of making the film was to negotiate powers relations within the prison. So because I'm also a film scholar, they invited me to talk to the prisoners and assist them in their process. While I was in the prison teaching the classes and seeing the materials, I realized that many of the prisoners who were making the film were confined in a part of the prison that they call El Centro de Rehabilitación, their rehabilitation center. This name may sound to many of you like an institution, right? An institution run by the state. But I soon learned that the Centro de Rehabilitación, such a technical name, was actually run by prisoners. And it wasn't a secular, per se, institution, or it was a church. So I was puzzled by the fact that an evangelical church run by the prisoners would serve as a place of confinement within a place of confinement run by the state. So this is almost like a matryoshka, you know. You have one prison inside another prison. The outside prison run by the state in theory, or co-run, I will talk about that in a minute, and the other run by an evangelical pastor that at the same time was controlled by the gang leader. So when I saw this, I decided to inquire further, and I spent about 5 years visiting the prison and interfacing with the people making the movie, but also with the pastors and the gangs who run that prison. In time, as I took notes and I saw the workings of the community and the rules and the myths that run the community, I came up with the hypothesis that the formation of this prison inside the prison somehow could allow me to understand the workings or the creation of power structures in this particular prison. In time, I realized that the prisoners who were running the larger prison were almost emulating the creation of the modern state, in which, as you may recall, the modern state comes about when the monarch controls the power of the church. So in a way, these prisoners were controlling the church and using it to punish other prisoners. When they were doing this, the levels of violence in that prison fell significantly. So what was interesting to me is that the prisoners were replicating mechanisms of the state, within the prison, and creating structures of confinement and social control within the prison. One positive aspect of this is that, in fact, violence was significantly reduced in a situation in which the state basically have withdrawn and only control the perimeter, the outside of the prison. On the other side, one thing that I discovered in time is that many of the oppressive mechanisms that we see in the state were also replicated by the prisoners. Perhaps one of the most worrisome was the extraction of labor. So I realized that some of these prisoners who were confined were performing labor that other prisoners didn't want to do, or the state didn't want to do. So this case study of this prison within a prison run by evangelicals allow me to see the relationship between the prisoners and the state, how the government of the prisoners function, the contradictions in that process, and different forms of exploitation, along with containment of violence. The other important thing that I saw was the use of some kind of medical discourse to justify that order. So I saw the use of religious language to justify the existing order of the prison. I even saw mythical language used to explain the eruption of violence when it did happen. And I describe in the chapter some of these rituals. So just in concluding the particular chapter, I basically see the government of the prisoners, the inmate government, el gobierno de los presos, as replicating some structures that we see in the state outside of the prison. So that's my chapter. With regards to the conclusion of the volume, after a 400-page volume, it wasn't easy to summarize the conclusion, but the conclusion does a little bit of what every conclusion does in any text. It's putting together a synthesis of the main themes of the book, but also it tries to do something else, that is put forward a thesis, so it doesn't conclude but opens to something that Andres and I would like to explore, or we're currently exploring, which is this notion of the penal carnivalesque. And what are we thinking in terms of this concept? We borrow from Mikhail Bakhtin's notion of the carnival, which he studies for the Middle Ages, as this cultural practice in which the order is subverted. The carnival is this moment in which the people experience a momentary freedom by the subversion of order. It's like an upside-down world. But Bakhtin says that order is subverted only for a moment, and at the end of the carnival, order is reinstituted. So we apply that kind of theory to the subversions of order in Latin American prisons. What we wanted to do, though, is not to produce this vision that is exoticist of the things that we see in Latin American prisons. Quite the contrary, we want to reject the vicarious consumption of violence of these prisons, and suggest that the reason why these institutions function the way they function has to do with the history of Latin America and the history of how the knowledge, the modern penal discourse, is inserted in Latin America. In other words, what we want to see is the specificity and the historical, social, cultural, and historical specificity of the Latin American prison system. To do that, we anchor the conversation on the legacies of the colonial order in Latin America. And again, we are outlining this general idea to develop more research in the future. But one of the things that we say is that this particularity is not only of Latin America, but something that you can see in the global South. So, for example, some research in Africa suggests some analogies with the case of Latin America. So therefore, the particular expressions of the modern penal order in Latin America respond rather than an exoticist or an atavic culture at the way of Latin America negotiates their insertion in the world order. It has to do with matters of how to control the surplus population, how Latin America inserts itself in the production of commodities for global markets, how it can or cannot absorb the surplus population in offering jobs. And just to wrap up, I would say that perhaps the most important consequence of this approach is, again, resist the easy consumption of these histories of violence and horror of the confinement of this population, to reduce that as some kind of simplistic, exoticistic representation. These things are anchored in a particular history that ought to be studied with its specificity. So I will stop here so we can perhaps open the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all three of you. Indeed, we will open the floor for questions. Colleagues, feel free to either use the chat or raise your hand. I am actually very curious hearing about your experiences. How were the prison populations? I mean, how receptive were they to your research when you're actually going on the ground and taking this approach of, really getting into the nitty-gritty of what's going on in the prisons? Any takers? Oh, go ahead, Sacha, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so this is very interesting for me because I think you need to have a certain kind of personality, but at the same time, of course, you need to gain people's confidence and trust. So most of, when I go on short visits, I would always make sure I follow with an officer, get to the fundown, as they'll call it, to the back of the prison, and then I would always separate and make sure I go straight up to the Liga sound, as they call it, wherever, put my hand through. But of course, it's only a few minute conversation. And the important thing is people realize why I'm there. It's absolutely, absolutely crucial that I'm not a human rights lawyer. I'm not a journalist. And that's fine. For the ethnographic studies, I've been involved in research this year. I've spent 6 weeks doing research since February, when finally I managed to get back into Brazil. And prisons are receptive, but of course with some it will take a few days. And I'd say that's the absolutely crucial thing. Once they open up, it's almost dangerous. They're saying too much.
Mm-hmm.
And actually I have to say, look, I don't need to know about everything that happened in the common prison system and in the APAC system, all the things you suffered, all the things you did. But it's incredible how open they are, even to prison officers. They can be very, very open. So certainly with me, the reception is almost too much. I have to be careful not to get too close, even in a 2-week period. And then it's the break afterwards, which is hard. So certainly my experience, I don't know if it's because I'm an outsider who speaks their language that surprises them. I don't know if it's the Brazilian warmth people have. I don't know if it's because people who have really suffered, and probably a combination of all of these. So certainly for me, it's absolutely not been a barrier whatsoever.
Just to add to what Sacha mentions, As ethnographers, prison research presents certain barriers to the notion of the ethnographer as this lone, intrepid traveler. You know, we generally speaking travel in groups or as colleagues or adjuncts to, say, a human rights delegation, a defense lawyer, perhaps a team of forensic researchers, or even just a member of a family or a religious group or community. So we have to be quite sort of mindful of our place, which is at best second place, and should be given sort of potential future ethnographers should pay that heed, that when we bear witness to the dealings and dynamics inside prison, we're bearing secondary witness. Although we are collecting testimony, we are embedded within the communities of research.
I would like to add briefly that one of the things that I found most interesting is, of course, I did experience this deep connection that you develop in time after 5 years. Knowing these people, you really get to know them. They share their lives with you, and as Sacha was saying, sometimes you have to encourage them to not to show certain things, or not to, for example, they would take pictures or stuff like that. You say, like, perhaps that's not helpful. But I also was very impressed by the keen political awareness of this function of bearing witness. And I think this is a very important takeout of this, is that in the interaction with us, they understood the importance of representing their stories. They saw the possibility of mediation with institutions. So stories or demands were crafted in a very purposeful way. And what that revealed to me is a keen political conscience within the community. Now, when I say this, I'm not only talking about the political awareness of those running the prison. Also, those run by those running the prison from within had a political agenda in terms of negotiating against the gang leaders, for example. So they would know that we would come from outside, so they were able to present certain demands, not in front of the state, but in front of the gang leaders. And all those different levels of negotiations, we would partake and function there. Of course, that entails tremendous responsibility. But that was a very important takeout of the experience. Hard, of course. It's very hard to do. And also, I would say personally, one of the most painful things is when you leave the community, that the leaving of the prison and the awareness that people stay there behind was something that is, it was painful. So.
I can imagine, especially, as you say, if you've spent 5 years getting to know a particular group of a particular situation in a prison, and therefore the people involved, then yes, I can imagine that is very difficult. Colleagues, any questions from the floor? Seems they're very
not from the floor. No.
No. Oh, I think that's you, Chris. No, I'm very, I really found the whole looking at community and the way you framed this work is, I think, super interesting and a very useful sort of lens to approach things by. And I'm so fascinated by all these relationships and power dynamics, and like you said, the communities within the communities. I'm also excited that at the conclusion you are proposing further research and looking further into the colonial histories. Have you already started this next chapter, and will you be more inclusive to include, for example, the African continent? You were saying there are parallels, of course, because of their colonial histories as well. So I guess, will there be a volume 2 with an expanded international focus?
So for my particular project with Andres, we will sadly have to be again narrow the scope to Latin America, just because we want to, even though it's going to be a more theoretical proposal, it will be anchored in research on Latin America. But we would love to find interlocutors that would expand this theory to other parts of the global South. For a second volume, I defer to Sacha and Chris, who are the masters of production of these volumes.
I'd like to add to that as you know, I first met Chris through the Global Prisons Research Network. I think it was 2010, and it's phenomenal how this research, which this group of it was based in Copenhagen originally, but when we first met, we had African scholars, Asian scholars, Latin American scholars, and people from the north, like myself, who were researching in these places. And we've kind of gone off slightly in 3 different directions. And there is no doubt that there are still meetings that we will come back together. I remembered once Andrew Jefferson, who has research, he started in Africa and then in Asia, and he once messaged me and said, "I'm with some prison guards in Myanmar," this before a few years ago, looking at your work, and he said, "These prison guards said, what you are writing could apply to our own experience." And I think that Louise is right to say that, of course, there are going to be key differences, but the reality is that it's the global north that is exceptional. It's a global north where prisons are, in theory, reasonably well resourced, where prisoners seem to not have this kind of clear consciousness, of discrimination that we see, in the global south. And so absolutely, this is a lifetime's work for all of us. And please, Louise, if we're going to do another volume, we'll need you. We'll need your intellect and your support.
Giovanna, one of the interesting things about your question is that there is tremendous pushback in comparing different prison systems, in different types of prisons. So the mere act of doing comparative ethnography poses a challenge to different types of, let's say, criminological, historical, anthropological, sociological inquiry. And so we're quite proud of what we've done, and it's not as if prison ethnographers succumb to what used to be called methodological nationalism. We share rather indiscriminately new ideas and theories, and we've been excited to see how some of the concepts, the forms of the sort of reflexive research invoked in by our articles and our introduction and conclusion are being taken up in the field. Personally, I am writing a brief book on global prison dynamics, thinking about the way in which the global South is, in a sense, and the dynamics of prison order are sort of, in a sense, moving north rather than just staying put. So there's these are stories of migrations of models and tremendous pushback, and as we argue at the very beginning of this book, it's unless you understand prison dynamics, you're going to have a very difficult time on even wrapping your mind around the amorphous yet and shadowy yet omnipresent and powerful modalities of gang and cartel violence, right? And this applies all over the world, frankly.
No, absolutely. I do see that we do have a question. This is directed to Sacha. The question is, I would like to know if the current book or other work, if there is an analysis on APACs, APACS, and religion. Is this matter addressed? If it is, how do you see it?
Okay, thank you. I was just writing a response, and so it's much easier to say. So in terms of the research that I've done, I've been a Leverhulme fellow for 2 years, and so I'm now I've got some recent papers which are not in this book. This book only touches very, very briefly on the research that I originally did in 2012, and the same in my monograph. There's not a great deal in there, but I do have one paper from 2014, which please email me afterwards. I can send you. It was published in Brazil as well as England, slightly different versions. And I have a paper I wrote recently, which I can also send, a preparatory paper. And at the moment, I'm working on writing up my ethnography there. So in a few months' time, they'll have two more papers. So please email me. I can send them to you. I don't focus on religion. I'm approaching these prisons from a penal abolitionist perspective. I'm looking at what happens when you hand over power, to put it very bluntly, to the people who live in their institution. Like I have power over my own house, and this is what I'm studying. I'm thinking in a world without prisons, we would have places similar to the APACs. We would take away some of the religious element. In Brazil, you would have to always have a certain amount of religion. And if I want to import this to the global north, we'd have to approach it quite differently. So humanity, yes. Humanity is the basis of religion. It's the basis of my life too. And we see this in human rights discourses, and so this is what I'm really looking at. And so for the APAC system, if it did exist, you would take out 90% of people who are there. You would have a place which would be more like a refuge. You would take out all punitive elements, so a place of detention, of involuntary detention, which only certain people might need to be in, might want to be in for a brief period of time. The religious element of the PACs that doesn't interest me. That's not my research. I'm looking for the things that the global north and other parts of the world can learn from.
Absolutely. For Luis, we have a question for you. How did the rest of the prisoners accept so well that the gang in power would run the place? Wasn't there any gang challenging that power dynamic?
In the chapter, I tell the story briefly of how the current gang got to control the prison. So yes, there is these orders are always been challenged, and it's a complex. The turn of power operates in a very complex manner. Some things have to do with control of weapons, of course, violence. That's the obvious one, but others are, to me, most interesting, have to do with negotiations with the state, as Sacha described earlier today. Also, the politics of trading, because these prisons are porous, trading with resources that come from outside, not only weapons, but food, medicine. All those things give power to certain parts of the community. But none of that order is never completely solidified. In the period when I was doing my ethnography, there was a government inside the prison that was fairly stable, but it's not so much so. There's a new order that has been in the last few years. But they accept the order of that state within the state, like we accept the order of the state outside, right? It's a combination of norms, rules, rituals, and power and force.
Absolutely. I'm thinking, Sacha, if you want to send the article, I can send it to the participants who registered for this event. And I'm just reading, there is a thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. If you have a digital copy, we do have colleagues in the library in Vienna. We have the print copy, but we also have the ebook version of the book. So you should be able to access it no matter where you are, in whatever field of office you're working out of. But yes, I think that should be, I'm not seeing any more questions. And I think we are out of time. We stayed a few minutes extra. Thank you so much. This has been super interesting for us. And we really appreciate being even kind of your guinea pig audience, I guess you said, because it's the first time you've really gotten to present the book. Yes, we will let you get on with your days. For those in Vienna, it's getting quite late. It's already 6 p.m. For all of our colleagues in Latin America, I think it's lunchtime. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for making the time to share this book with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Thank you.